If you had told me in the late 1960s, yeah, I was an adult in the late 1960s, and if you had told me at that time that one day I'd spend 15 years teaching English in Indonesia and actually loving it, I would have laughed in your face and walked away muttering, absolutely not. You see, I had already done my time. 6 long years teaching Spanish in high school in Los Angeles. And to say I hated it is putting it mildly. Every morning the alarm clock was my enemy. Every evening I dragged myself home in agony, knowing that the next day would be exactly the same. I remember the last day of my 6th year so clearly. Walking out of that high school, I swore to myself, never again, never, ever again. And I meant it, or so I thought. Hi, I'm Kate, and I found that saying never doesn't work. Yeah, I thought I meant it, but then came the years of, well, what now? After I walked away from the classroom, I had no master plan. I just knew I needed a paycheck, and that meant taking whatever work I could get. So I bounced through all kinds of office jobs. I never stayed at one job because, I hated each one more than the last. That's right. I didn't like any of them. I was restless. I was bored. But I had rent to pay, bills to cover, groceries to buy. I couldn't just sit around waiting for inspiration to strike. Somewhere deep down, I still had this idea that I wanted a career that meant something. I wanted something that I knew would help people. I'd always been fascinated by human behavior and why people do what they do. So I decided to go back to graduate school for a doctoral degree in psychology. The plan was to become a clinical therapist. It felt right. It felt important. And it was definitely a big change from being an executive's admin assistant. Graduate school was wonderful. I loved the classes and felt like I was really on the right track. But just when I was preparing for final exams, life threw me a curveball. Yeah, that's what life does. I was flipping through the Chicago Tribune one day and I saw a small ad for a job in Indonesia. Well, that sounded unusual. Maybe I should give it a try, at least answer the ad. Yeah, it sounded a little adventurous. And I thought, why not check it out? Yeah. The position was for on the job training of local Indonesians to input English language materials on a TRS 80 computer. One of those early, clunky models that feels like a dinosaur now. It wasn't a classroom job, and that was absolutely key for me. This was training adults in a workplace setting, and it was only for 3 months. I figured 3 months in Indonesia, then back to my doctoral program. What's the worst that could happen? So I took a leave of absence from school, packed my bags, and got on a plane. But guess what? 3 months turned into, well, forever. The job was fascinating in its own way. The TRS 80 might have been a technological marvel at the time, but it looked more like a television with a keyboard attached. But it was surprisingly satisfying work. And most of the people I worked with were eager and curious, except for Vicky. If you watched the video I made about the problem I had with Vicky, you'll understand why I was happy to say goodbye to that job when the contract ended after 3 months. Yes, I was happy to leave it. But I wasn't ready to leave Indonesia. That was my first real taste of Indonesia. The energy, the warmth of the people, the sheer difference from anything I'd ever known. I had no burning desire to rush back to the US, but staying meant figuring out how to support myself. When I looked at my skills on paper, I didn't see a long list of career options available for a foreigner in Indonesia at that time. The obvious answer was teaching English. Oh, but that old promise, when I said never again, still echoed in my head. I'd hated teaching Spanish in the US so much. But practicality won. I walked into American language training in Jakarta, one of several private language schools there. I had a bachelor's degree in teaching foreign language, so I thought, well, maybe that will count for something. Turns out I didn't even need to worry about qualifications. The school, like many others at that time, was desperate for native English speakers. Honestly, they would have hired any warm body who spoke English fluently, even if it wasn't their first language. I was hired on the spot and told to start the very next day. And then came a huge surprise. I actually liked doing it. The first thing I noticed was how different this was from my old Spanish teaching days. Most of my new classes were focused on preparing students for the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language. The TOEFL isn't about memorizing cute little phrases or reciting scripted conversations. It's about mastering the kind of English needed for acceptance at an English-speaking university overseas. That was real, tangible, goal-oriented teaching, and I loved it. Yeah. When I taught Spanish back in the US, the teaching method I'd been trained in involved repetition drills, memorizing sentences in Spanish, and reciting them back to the teacher and the class. It was dull for the students and dull for the teacher, at least for me. No wonder I'd been miserable. But here in Indonesia, my students wanted to learn. They weren't in class because they had to be. They were there because mastering English and getting a degree from an English-speaking university overseas could change their lives. So that job led to another, and before I knew it, I had built a career as an English teacher in Jakarta. Over the years, I taught at American Language Training, ILP, and ELTI. And then I ended up on projects and ended up in Yogyakarta, which I love. I love living in Jogja, yeah. Yeah, eventually I started working on government projects aimed at preparing employees to earn master's degrees in English-speaking countries. These were not casual evening classes. The projects were intense, 6 months long, with classes all day, 5 days a week. My students came from all across Indonesia, leaving their homes to live near the training center. Their areas of expertise were economics, finance, environmental policy, you name it. My job was to get them to the level of English where they could handle graduate level coursework in English abroad in whatever their area of expertise was. It was demanding, but deeply rewarding. Every time a student finished the program and got accepted into a university in the US, Canada, or Australia, or the UK, I felt like I'd played a small part in that person's journey. So yes, classroom teaching in Indonesia worked really well for me. Looking back, I can see the reason I loved teaching in Indonesia and lasted 15 years at it comes down to a few things. The students were definitely motivated. They weren't bored teenagers stuck in a mandatory class. They were adults with big dreams and real possible results. I wasn't bound to outdated teaching methods or outdated materials. I designed lessons that actually worked. In the end, I learned about Indonesia from my students, and they learned English from me. Win-win, right? We swapped stories, ideas, and perspectives. This work mattered and gave me a real sense of purpose. I could see the results in my students' successes. So here's a big lesson that I learned. That phrase, never again, that I promised myself all those years ago, yeah, that promise to myself I told you about at the beginning of this video, that I'd never do classroom teaching again, remember? Turns out that it wasn't about teaching at all. It was about teaching in the wrong environment, in the wrong context. Even work you're good at can feel like torture, but in the right context, the very same work can become a joy. Indonesia gave me that right context. And what was supposed to be a 3-month detour here ended up becoming not just a career, but a whole new life. So if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button. It really helps my channel and it helps other people find my videos. And if you're curious about more real life expat adventures that I've lived here in Indonesia, subscribe. Yeah, I share videos 2 or 3 times a week. And I tell you what life is like living here in Indonesia. So thanks for coming along. Bye for now. See you next time.